The Supreme Court's healthcare and gay marriage rulings are making national news, and they're certainly big news here in our area. But another ruling isn't getting nearly as much attention, and I'm talking about the High Court's decision on housing discrimination. The court strengthened the Fair Housing Act by ruling that discrimination doesn't have to be intentional to be illegal. Now, this issue is near and not so dear to Westchester County. After a lawsuit by an anti-discrimination group, the county made a landmark desegregation agreement with the government way back in 2009. Promised to add affordable housing into overwhelmingly white neighborhoods, and that has had mixed results at best. New York suburbs are routinely called among the most racially segregated in the country, and the court-appointed monitor in the settlement has long accused County Executive Rob Astorino of dragging his feet on county compliance, even going so far as to depose Astorino last week. And Mr. Mayor, this is an issue that certainly came up in 2013 as you were running for county executive against Mr. Astorino. First of all, is your take on the court's decision about non-intentional discrimination accurate, and do you think this puts on the more pressure on Astorino to cut a deal or at least live up to the letter of the agreement?
Well, I do think it's relevant. It did not address Westchester explicitly,
right.
But the argument that the Astorino administration has consistently made is that if zoning does not discriminate on its face, therefore it cannot be discriminatory. And this Supreme Court decision really puts that argument to rest. And I kind of wonder if maybe the Astorino folks were hoping and expecting the Supreme Court to rule the other way. And if the court had gone the other way, it might have been relevant to how this ultimately got resolved. So where we are now, whether you think the Supreme Court was correct or incorrect, it does highlight the complete absence of any coherent endgame. No real strategy for how we're going to bring this long, costly dispute to a close.
Astorino's argument has been that essentially this is social engineering by the federal government, that they're trying to say that every neighborhood has to look a certain way or have a certain portion. And there is an argument to be made. I mean, he's been making it for 5 years, but should there be a formula on how white or not white a neighborhood should be?
That's never been an accurate account of what is required under the county settlement or what is required under the law. That has always been a kind of a made-up horror story in order to scare people and conceal the real issue. The challenge for us is not to make affordable housing possible in every neighborhood. The issue is whether affordable housing will be permissible in any neighborhood. And those are fundamentally different questions. So exclusionary zoning rules out multifamily housing throughout an entire community. And that is a much easier thing to overcome.
Scott, let me pull back to a 30,000-foot level on this, because it does seem like they're saying, the Supreme Court is saying, well, even if it's not intentional and you wind up with a segregated community, that's unacceptable also. So it does seem like on some level, and I'm not sure there's a formula that they have, or if it's just a we'll know it when we see it situation here, where they're saying you can't just have one group of people in one neighborhood.
Well, I think it is, and we'll know it when we see it. I think that's where the court ended up. Unfortunately, I think, I mean, discrimination versus affordable housing, and they're not necessarily equal. There are different issues and pieces to it. And you're not going to overrule municipal zoning in New York State. You can't. And that's where HUD is wrong on this issue. The question of building affordable housing is something else again entirely. So, I mean, you really got to look at some of the arguments here very carefully. But we in Rockland County, for example, made a very strong pitch for affordable housing and multifamily housing in different places. I will tell you, one elected official, when we pushed for multiple housing in certain areas, said, well, then their kids will come here and then we'll have higher school taxes. I mean, so it's not just, there are all sorts of issues surrounding this. And of course, a lot of people think affordable housing is essentially urban housing that's being paid for by the government, and their taxes are going to go up. So, I mean, you've really got to pull this thing apart to determine, I think, what the next steps are.
It just seems to me that no matter what the Supreme Court ruled on this issue, the county administration, Mr. Astorino, they've been grasping at straws for years to come up for what many would, on the opposite side would say are excuses to continue the status quo. And I just don't see any real changes, because, I mean, and you would know this better than I would, Mr. Mayor, but how long? It seems like this issue's been going on for 30 years.
Yeah, it's been at least 6, and with no end in sight. And again, I realize I'm repeating myself, but whether you agree with the settlement or disagree with the settlement, whether you agree with how the Supreme Court came down or don't agree, we all have an interest in bringing this long and expensive saga to a close. And the Astorino administration has never articulated a clear strategy for how we're going to end this all.
I don't see how the Supreme Court decision clears any of this up, because what it said, and I think this is the innovative housing case, is that, as in many areas of law, it's no longer discriminatory intent, it's sort of disparate impact. Like the thing speaks for itself, right? If you're looking at the area, there are no racist, there are no discriminatory policies explicitly like there used to be.
It's just a process that
It's
ends
just
up
a process
being-
ends up, but so is this a surrogate for making class some sort of suspect classification, where if you have money, you want to live around other people that have money and have good schools, and then wealthy people in some areas tend to look a certain way but not others? And what do you do about the fact that the report just came out? You have middle-class African-American families living with lower-class families because they don't feel comfortable or don't want to be in more affluent neighborhoods, but you'll have middle-class whites living with wealthier whites. How do you break this apart? And last point, affordable housing is not the same thing, as I absolutely agree with the county executive, as discriminatory housing or discriminatory policy. You know, we have these fights, for example, in Brooklyn Bridge Park, right? They're going to build affordable housing. This is not for families making $44,000 a year and hope on a list to get into NYCHA housing. They're families that are making $130,000 a year and are thinking, wouldn't it be nice to live in a nice area? So the numbers get very weird, and it's a national decision, and we're talking about New York numbers.
Look, there's no question this is a complex issue. Complex on every level. Complex as a matter of policy. Complex as a matter of morality. Complex as a matter of just how we relate to each other. But the court case, at least as I understand it, is not really about whether housing patterns may exist in one way or another. It's whether government policy has contributed to those housing patterns in some fashion. That's the key distinction that has to be drawn. And I wasn't suggesting that the Supreme Court's decision clears this up. Rather that if they had ruled the other way, it would have created a new avenue for the county administration.
As confusing as it is, there is a way forward.
Is the divide? We're so focused on race and racial identities in communities in things like affirmative action. Is the dividing line more class and income?
Well, I'll
as
put my
opposed
lawyer.
to race?
I'll put my lawyer hat on. But class and poverty are not suspect classifications, and race is. So it only is exhibited, and you have a qualified plaintiff, and you have a qualified aggrieved class based on race, because you can't do it based on poverty. So what are you going to do in areas where everybody's white, or everybody's Hispanic, or everybody's West Indian? You could really, race in this case is a surrogate for class, because you can't bring a case based on class.
Well,
is my understanding.
I think that's well described, and I think this Supreme Court decision, like several recently, it leaves open the question of, well, what are we really talking about? It's like believe it or not, the old pornography. Well, we don't know.
Said, right?
Yeah, it's we'll know when we see it because.
And that has shifted. You could put on, like, what you see on HBO, you would never have seen when
That's
I was
right,
growing
that's
up.
right.
So
Well,
these things do change.
because the Supreme Court just decided they're going to take up another affirmative action case. I mean, they just took one up a couple of years ago. They're going to take another one based on the University of Texas in their next session. And a lot of people in Texas are saying it doesn't necessarily have to be about race. What you need are income disparities so that you can really get a sample of the population. So that's where you have people who are mixing.
I was involved in the settlement of property tax assessments in Nassau County years ago, where they found that because Nassau County grew west to east, that homes that were assessed at a higher rate years ago, which were all Irish, Italian, Jewish communities that are now all communities of color, and the white folks had moved farther north and further east, where back then they were assessed at a much lower rate. That was found to be in a federal court. They said, if you guys don't settle this, I'm going to say it's racially discriminatory, because you can't have homes that cost a fraction of what they cost elsewhere at higher property tax assessments than they are in Port Washington and Manhasset. So,
Yeah, well, and municipalities hate to reassess.
yeah,
I mean,
because everybody's angry.
Yeah, because everybody gets.
The judge is happy and everyone hates you.
That's right.
Mr. Mayor, last words?
Unfortunately, in this country, race and income correlate. And that's a product of a history we're all very much aware of and cannot ignore. And so while it's correct that they are two different things and they have to be treated in two different ways, we can't ignore that interrelationship. And that's why all of this is so very
Which
difficult.
is why it's encouraging the court wanted to do this.
I said last word. I said last word. That's it. We're gonna take a break. Up next, the session in Albany is over, but the drama, it's just beginning.